On June 23, 1812, Napoleon leads the largest army ever assembled in Europe across the Niemen River into Russia. Tsar Alexander has backed out of his agreement to blockade England and is preparing for war. Napoleon plans to dictate the terms of a new deal on the battlefield. 70 miles from Moscow, near the village of Borodino, the Russian army digs in and waits. At dawn on September 7th, 130,000 French troops smash into the Russians. Finally, exhausted, the Russians withdraw. Napoleon has lost 30,000 men and 10 generals. His chief surgeon performs 200 amputations in 24 hours. The price was high, but the road to Moscow is open. When Napoleon arrives, he finds the city deserted. The next day, fire breaks out. Two-thirds of Moscow is destroyed by arsonists. For 5 weeks, Napoleon waits for the Tsar to surrender. But Alexander has a cunning scheme of his own. The Russian winter is closing in. His food supplies dwindling, Napoleon bitterly orders the long march home. Now the Russians launch their cruelest attack. They hound the French, forcing them back down the road to Borodino, past the bloated corpses of their comrades. Temperatures plummet to nearly zero. Food runs out. Stragglers freeze and die, while Napoleon rides comfortably in his carriage, eating 3 meals a day. For the French, the campaign becomes a race to the Beretyna River, which means Poland and safety. But the Russians get there first. Napoleon will go home, the architect of one of the worst disasters in military history. His once grand army is in ruins. His empire is crumbling. His old enemies declare war. Soon the Allied forces of 5 nations will march into Paris. Napoleon's fate is sealed. Life is unbearable for me, he tells a comrade. In his darkest hour, he contemplates suicide and asks his doctor to concoct a poison. The poison is strong enough to kill 2 men. But his body rejects it. Napoleon had wanted to leave life. Now instead, he must leave France. Napoleon conquered Europe and for nearly 2 decades ruled it with an iron fist. Now his enemies will accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. On April 6, 1814, a humiliated emperor abdicates. 2 weeks later, Napoleon leaves Fontainebleau for the last time. 600 loyal troops and 4 cannons will follow him into exile. He is bound for Elba, a small island in the Mediterranean not far from his native Corsica. There he will be mocked as emperor and sovereign. Napoleon's departure signaled a return to monarchy and the dark days before the Revolution. With the stroke of a pen, Louis XVIII restores France to its former borders and abolishes the empire. But for some, there's no turning back. After 10 months on a 38-square-mile island of scrub-covered mountains, Napoleon is getting bored. By early 1815, word reaches him that much of France, including the military, would cheer his return. Though it's a long shot, Napoleon can't resist the opportunity to recover his old glory. In March, he escapes from Elba, aboard a boat disguised as an English brig, and makes a dash for Paris. Along the way, every regiment sent by the king to arrest him joins him. When the news reaches the palace, Louis flees. Now the people openly embrace their former emperor. Napoleon promises to save France, to roll back the calendar to the days of the Revolution, to restore liberty, equality, and fraternity. Meanwhile, in Vienna, Napoleon's enemies have been busy carving up his empire. When news of Napoleon's return reaches them, they officially declare him an outlaw. Immediately, the Duke of Wellington heads for Belgium to join up with Field Marshal Gebhard Blücher and the Prussians. Although they outnumber Napoleon almost 2-1, Wellington is too smart to underestimate his opponent. Having Boney in command is worth 40,000 men, he remarks. Napoleon has 2 choices: stand and defend Paris, or head east and drive a wedge between the English and the Prussians. On June 15, 1815, he marches into Belgium. The next day, Napoleon attacks the Prussians on 2 fronts. For hours, he pounds the enemy. But with his army thinned out, he can't clinch a victory. Only a last-ditch assault by the elite French Guard drives the Prussians to retreat. That night, they head north to join Wellington, near the village of Waterloo. On the 18th, the French and the British face each other along a 3-mile ridge. Napoleon's plan is simple and familiar. Open with a bombardment, then attack Wellington's center. He ranges 4 divisions on the right wing and another 3 on the left. Wellington has taken the high ground, drawing up his forces along the crest of Mont Saint-Jean. He leaves his left flank open, expecting the Prussians to arrive and reinforce him. At 11:30 a.m., Gunfire signals the beginning of the Battle of Waterloo. 2 hours later, Napoleon launches the main attack. But his men line up in an outdated formation that presents Wellington with a perfect target. 5,000 are quickly cut down. Meanwhile, the Prussians are getting closer and closer. Napoleon has no choice but to hurl every last man at Wellington before they arrive. The first assault fails. Then his commanders order a cavalry charge. The British form into 20 squares interspersed with cannons. For the next 2 hours, waves of French cavalry break and die on the British lines. When the first group of Prussians arrives late in the afternoon, they attack Napoleon's right flank with fury. Still, the French fight bravely on, even breaking through Wellington's line before they're repulsed. Then a second group of Prussians appears out of nowhere. As if on cue, Wellington charges down the hill to meet them. Stunned and terrified, Napoleon's army collapses. It cost Wellington 20,000 men to win the Battle of Waterloo. It cost Napoleon twice as many to lose it. A month later, he surrendered to the British Navy for his second and final journey into exile. To prevent another escape, the emperor is taken to St. Helena, an island in the Atlantic 1,000 miles away and 1,000 miles from nowhere. Napoleon did not like Longwood, his home on St. Helena. A small wooden house converted from a cattle shed. It sits on a plateau where it can be watched from a nearby military camp. Patrols constantly crisscross the island. Napoleon cuts spy holes in the shutters so he can see without being seen. He complains to his jailers that he's an emperor, not a prisoner of war, but the British refuse to acknowledge his title.
Après la bataille. Après la bataille.
To pass the time, he writes his memoirs to his own advantage. He says of his renowned military genius, "I have fought 60 battles, and I have learned nothing that I did not know in the beginning." In the spring of his 6th year on St. Helena, his health deserts him. Racked by razor-sharp pains in his stomach, he dictates his last will and testament. In it, he expresses his wish to be buried on the banks of the Seine, amid the French people he loved so well. He died on May 5th, 1821. According to the autopsy, he died of cancer, but rumor has it he was poisoned by his British servants. Napoleon was buried in a valley on St. Helena. His aides fight over the inscription, and in the end, it's left blank. 19 years after Napoleon's death, King Louis Philippe petitioned England to return his remains to France. Today he lies in state at the military church Les Invalides in Paris, a fitting tribute to an extraordinary man. Deal on the battlefield. 70 miles from Moscow, near the village of Borodino, the Russian army digs in and waits. At dawn on September 7th, 130,000 French troops smash into the Russians. In 24 hours. The price was high, but the road to Moscow is open. When Napoleon arrives, he finds the city deserted. Finally, exhausted, the Russians withdraw. Napoleon has lost 30,000 men and 10 generals. His chief surgeon performs 200 amputations. On June 23, 1812, Napoleon leads the largest army ever assembled in Europe across the Niemen River into Russia. Tsar Alexander has backed out of his agreement to blockade England and is preparing for war. Napoleon plans to dictate the terms of a new... The next day, fire breaks out. Two-thirds of Moscow is destroyed by arsonists. For 5 weeks, Napoleon waits for the Tsar to surrender. But Alexander has a cunning scheme of his own. The Russian winter is closing in.